It's biblically based.
Good morning. Glad you're here this morning. As you can tell, I am not Kenny Mars. So he is up packing up his house up there, and we'll be back sometime during this week. So since they decided to stay here for a little longer than 6 months, they decided to move all their stuff. So he will be out today and Wednesday. Let's start with a word of prayer. Dear God, we thank you for every blessing in this life, and we thank you, Lord, for this time we can study, we can look at your word, and we pray, Lord, that you will guide us, that you will help us to get the things that you want us to get out of reading your word and studying your scriptures. And we ask, Lord, that you would bless us as we do so. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. All right, we are in chapter 8, and we finished up up through verse 39, where Christ had cast out legion, cast out the demons. And as we go through today, the rest of chapter 8 and part of chapter 9, I want you to look at the differences between when he tells them to go and proclaim him or the word or the kingdom, and when he tells them not to say anything. It's kind of an interesting look. I'm not sure I have all the answers to it. I just noticed that there's some differences. If you notice right at the end, of verse 39, he tells in chapter 8, Christ tells him to return to your own house and show great things that God has done to thee. And he went his way and published throughout the whole city how the great things that Christ had done. Christ tells him, you go tell everybody, and he goes and tells everybody. Okay, and so that's one at the end there of that story. Now, the next group of verses is a story of Jairus' daughter and a woman who was healed. Somebody read 40 through 56 for us, and then we'll try to unpack that. There's a lot of stories we're going to start, that this section starts to go through. I'm not sure how many of them we'll get through today, but chapter 8, 40 through 56. Can I get it, Bill? Thank you.
Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, the ruler of the synagogue, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. Who touched me? Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you. But Jesus said, someone touched me. I know that the power has gone out from me. Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace. As Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue ruler. Your daughter is dead, he said. Don't bother the teacher anymore. Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, Don't be afraid, just believe and she will be healed. When he arrived at the house of Jairus, he did not let anyone go in with him except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Meanwhile, all the people were wailing and mourning for her. Stop wailing, Jesus said. She is not dead, but asleep. They laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. And he took her by the hand and said, My child, get up. Her spirit returned, and at once she stood up. Then Jesus told them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, and he ordered them not to tell anyone what had happened.
All right. So you notice right at the end there, he says, don't go tell anybody. Now, I don't know how in the world you're going to hide that a kid's been raised from the dead when the whole town knows that. But that's what he tells them at the end of that story. And we'll talk about that more in a minute, but as I'm reading through this section, of chapters. It's interesting to see what he's trying to do there. So there's a lot to unpack there. It says when he returned, where had he been? He just cast out legions. Where was that?
The Sea of Galilee, the Galilee.
Gadara, it's over in this area on the south east side of the Sea of Galilee, over in here. And his home base is Capernaum. And remember, Kenny showed you some pictures of Capernaum over the last few weeks. It's a seaside town. It's on the Sea of Galilee. It's where they believe Peter was lived. And if you go there today, there's it's like any tourist place. Benjamin Franklin slept here, and they built a monument over it. This is Peter's house, and you can actually walk on a glass floor and look down into the home of Peter. It's right on the seaside. It's a fishing village, and most people believe that that's where he's returned to. He's come back to that area. Kenny did also show you one picture of the synagogue that was in Capernaum. It was hard to tell from the picture, but one of the things I learned when I was there, or that the guide told us, in the synagogue there was a ground floor, and then there was a balcony area. And the women were in the balcony, and the men were on the ground floor, because that was their tradition. And many believe that that's where the impetus came for Paul to say for women to keep silent in the church. Because if they were up there chatterboxing around, and nobody could hear what was going on downstairs. And so that whether that's true or not, I don't know, but that's what basically was saying, don't interrupt the services. Don't interrupt the reading of the scriptures or whatever. And in those older buildings, they're all stone, and it echoes. It echoes a lot. So he asks him a guy named Jairus comes to him, and my only daughter is lying, dying. Now, who is Jairus? What's a ruler of a synagogue?
Probably a Pharisee.
Possibly. Wasn't necessarily a priest, though. We would probably call him the deacon in charge of the building and the deacon in charge of services. He's the guy that set the schedule for when the prayers were going to be read and who was going to read them. He's the guy that called to meeting. He's the guy that made sure, I won't say the lights stayed on, but the candles stayed lit. And that the floor was swept. And he was the guy in charge of that facility. So he was an important guy, but he wasn't necessarily a spiritual leader in the sense of a priest or a Levite or something like that. But he was an important guy in the city. And so he comes to Christ, and what's his request? What's he asked Jesus to do? Come to my house. My daughter is sick. It's amazing how Christ's reputation has gone far and wide. Capernaum's kind of his home base, so especially there, he knows what's going on. The people know what's going on. And there's been some interactions. Remember, he's already healed Peter's mother-in-law. He's done a number of things in Capernaum. So they know of what's going on with him. And so he asked him to come. And then mixed in here, in the middle of that story, something else happens. A lady comes and touches the hem of his garment. What do we know about this lady? How long has she been sick? About as long as that little girl's been alive, huh? She's been sick for 12 years. Now, we don't know exactly what the issue of blood was, but no matter what it was, it doesn't sound good. You can imagine, well, for one thing, she's going to be ceremonially unclean. She can't go into the synagogue. She can't get a hug from somebody because it'll make them unclean. She can't participate really in Jewish life because she's unclean, similar to a leper. That's what's happened to her. And after suffering from 12 years, we also know she's broke, right? She's spent every dime that she's got on doctors and, well, obviously not faith healers, but on doctors and on people trying to cure her. So it tells you she's destitute. She's an outcast of society. And she's probably very frail and weak. If you were sick and couldn't even necessarily go to the market and didn't have money to buy food, this woman is probably very weak and very frail. But Artemi?
Poor.
Poor?
Poor.
Yes, oh yes, very, very much so. Yes, I agree. And poor. So she's, you know, we kind of gloss over that in this story sometimes. I know I do when I read it, and I thought, oh yeah, she just had great faith. Well, she did. But a lot of it came from her condition. She was desperate. There was nothing, she tried everything she knew to do. It was like a last resort. Well, this guy says he can heal some people. I'm going to find out. And so she goes and she touches the hem of his garment in a crowd, and Christ turns around and says, "Who touches me?" And what's his disciples' reaction?
Who hasn't touched you?
Yeah. You're in a crowd, really? There's people bumping and bustling and pushing and shoving, and who does that, you know? What do you mean? And he says, I know that power went out from me. Christ healed this lady because of her faith. It wasn't necessarily because of his faith. It was her faith. She acted on her faith. So many times we want the Lord to just, you take control, you do it, and I'm going to do nothing, and you take care of me. You fix it, God. And here, this woman in her probably emaciated state, weak, poor, sick, outcast of society, probably trying to hide herself not just from Christ, but from the rest of the crowd. And she comes in and touches Christ's garment and is instantly healed. And it's interesting. Christ knows the power went out, and she immediately knew that she'd been healed. So that it wasn't like, oh, go home and I hope you get better. Derek?
It's interesting that you focus on her condition and her faith in the power, because what as you were talking, one of the things that struck me was God makes the statement many times that it is the weak and the poor and the afflicted that show the power of God.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's going to change the world. And what a prime example to really underscore what God always says right here. And at first, according to his own words, he doesn't even know who it is.
Right.
But yet the same thing happens right here.
Yep. There it is. Artemi, do you have something?
I think this is the last opportunity for her. She gave all her money. She don't have another opportunity, and this is very interesting. Why she suffered 12 years?
I agree. I don't know why.
And daughter of priest is 12 years too.
Hmm?
Is not a special sign. You know what the 12 mean?
Yeah, it could be something to do with the number 12. There's 12 apostles. I mean, that number is 12 tribes. I don't know.
12 is the end of simple counting.
End of what?
Simple counting. We count 1, 2, 3, 4, 11, 12. and later we say 13, 14, 12 is the end of counting. This is like 12, like dozen eggs, like this is.
Yeah, it's a common number, and it's used throughout. I always tell the old joke. Do you know how old that Isaac was when he went to be sacrificed? He was 12. Because if he's been a teenager, it wouldn't have been a sacrifice. Wyatt?
The phrase in verse 45 where Jesus says, "Who touched me?" It's not because Jesus didn't know who touched him. I believe he knew full well. But it's like God in the Garden of Eden when he said, "Where are you?"
Mm-hmm.
God is calling those who are hiding from him back into his presence, into relationship. This is a very beautiful question.
Well, and he's also getting ready to show to the apostles his power. There are other instances where he's in a crowd and it says the power was going out from him, emanating from him. And he was going to show his apostles and the people, all those around, the power that he had in being able to heal this woman. And what's her immediate reaction? She tries to hide, right? She knows something has happened. She knows, I'm healed. This is different. I've been to doctors. I've been to whatever. I've tried to purify myself. I've done everything I know to do, but it's different. And she tries to hide herself among the crowd, and it's kind of like, I mentioned Wednesday night, kind of like with Achan. They brought all the tribes, and they had to, go by tribe, and then by family, or clan, and then by family, all the way down until they found Achan, and he had to finally admit, yeah, I took some stuff from Jericho, and, I shouldn't have done that. And that's kind of this lady. After she realizes I can't hide any longer, they know who I am, everybody else has been ruled out, she's the one that it comes down to. What does Christ tell her when he finally talks with her?
Jesus made you well.
And what else?
Go in peace.
Go in peace. That's the same thing he said to the lady just a little bit before who was washing his feet with her tears in her hair. Go in peace. Troubled souls. Natasha.
I was gonna say, I think it speaks to her faith, because she knew if she just had to touch him, then she would be healed. And I think what's interesting is how when they tell him, everyone's touching you, like how, and so to me, it's kind of like how many people were touching him but didn't have the faith for whatever was ailing them to be healed, and she just knew she just had to touch him, and she would be healed.
I picture like you've seen where they're escorting politicians or whatever, or celebrities through a crowd, and they've got the security guards pushing people away, and people just want to touch them, or a sports figure, whoever it happens to be. That's kind of the scene I picture as they're walking through this town, and these people are all around, and yeah, who was that? What was it?
I just think it's such a beautiful testimony to Jesus that he's got this man at his feet begging him to come to his house, that his daughter's dying. And Jesus, in that moment, feels this power go from him. And he turns and he pivots. He could have said, hang on, we'll deal with this later, go over there. But he doesn't. He turns and he addresses this woman while this man is at his feet begging him for something else. Mm-hmm. And so it just speaks to the humanity of Jesus. He understood her pain, he understood her anguish, and he took this beautiful moment to address her before he addressed the person at his feet. And I just think that
it's a contrast, isn't it? Everybody knew what Jairus was asking for. He's come, he's bowed down at Jesus' feet, he's publicly asked, my daughter is dying, can you please come to my house? Other than teaching, he had no reason to turn around and consoling this woman. He had no reason to turn around and even worry about that. He could have just kept on walking through the crowd, and we would have had a story that says this lady touched him and was healed, and Jesus went on his way. But he didn't do that. He stopped and he talked to her. And as I mentioned, it's the same words that he used for the lady who was washing his feet. Troubled souls, those looking for comfort, those looking for peace, and he gives it to them. In both areas, or both instances, I should say, these were kind of outcasts of society. You remember the lady who was washing his feet? the Pharisee says, don't you know what kind of woman this is? How come you're letting her anoint your feet and wash your feet and anoint you with oil? And then here's this other lady who's ceremonially unclean and can't even participate in society. And their faith and their belief and their coming to Christ, and he's healing them in this case. And then he tells them, go in peace. And I think it's something, a lesson we should learn. We think and we look towards the glory in heaven. And that's absolutely what we should be doing. We should look towards our eternal home. But sometimes we forget about the peace we can have here. I mean, it doesn't promise you that things are always going to go great. It doesn't promise you you're going to be wealthy and have lots of kids and grandkids and life will be great and there won't be any sickness. And no. But he does offer you peace. And that's what that looking for heaven should bring to you, is a peace on this earth. That whatever's happening here, no matter how bad it can be, guess what's coming? Guess what you got to look forward to? And that gives you a comfort and a peace to deal with what's going on here on this earth. And I think we sometimes overlook that benefit, overlook that blessing that God has given us while here on this earth. You can see it in people, can't you? You see how some people, they worry all the time. They're a nervous wreck. They can't get out of their own way half the time because their things are going so crazy for them all the time. And then there's others who go through life and, well, you know, things happen and I have to deal with it. And it'll be okay. We'll get through this too. And that peace that God offers us, I think, like I said, many times we overlook. So yes, Jen.
I think that some of that comes from when we understand that there's a difference between peace and happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that peace comes from knowing who's in control despite what's going on in our life. And a lot of times, especially from a world view, happiness comes from me being the center of it all. Whereas peace comes from Christ being the center of our lives. And when we understand those two things, we know as Christians that we can have a life of peace despite what's going on around us. Does not mean we're going to have a life of happiness. That's not
As we define happiness, yes.
Right.
Yeah, that's very true. Our culture today very much revolves around what I want and what's going to make me happy, no matter what it does to anybody else around you. I have the right to be happy, and if that steps on your toes, too bad. And that's not the way Christ taught, but that's the way the world teaches these days. So, in the meantime, just had a little miracle here. Lady's cleansed, she's healed. Christ tells her to go in peace. What happens on the other side of town?
Well, the people watching the daughter believe she had died.
Okay. So somebody comes up and says, don't bother going. You don't need to go to that house because they've died. The daughter has died. The 12-year-old girl has died. You were so callous when you stood here and healed this woman that you left the time. You waited too long, and now this girl's died. What other story does that remind you of?
Lazarus.
Yep. No, he's been dead 3 days and stinks. You can't possibly raise him from the dead. And so what does Christ do despite what everybody else tells him to do?
He goes to meet a girl.
Goes to see the girl, goes to the house. And there's a group of mourners there. And in Jewish tradition, these weren't always just family members. These could be hired. You could hire mourners if you wanted to. I don't know that Jairus did that, but these people were to wail and cry, and this is big catastrophe that's gone on, and the death of a child is always a tragedy. So these people are there, and Christ tells them, don't worry, she's just asleep. She's not really dead. And what do? They laugh at him. And they laugh at him in such a way that the Greek words there mean that they laughed to scorn him. It wasn't just, that's funny. It was, you're an idiot. What are you doing? It's very much the same, although it's written in a different language, same concept of when Sarah laughed. Remember when God told her, you're going to have a baby? Yeah, you're out of your ever-loving mind. I'm way too old to have a baby. It's that kind of laugh when they're just scorning Christ and telling him that, really, you can't do this. You're out of your mind. And yet they've seen things like this happen, but they don't believe. But how does Jairus feel about it? He believes, right? It's his faith that he went to see Christ. It's his faith that even after they said, your daughter's dead, he takes Christ to his house. It's his faith that when all the rest of the mourners laugh and scorn Christ, that he goes inside with Christ. And he believes that Christ can do something. Who all does Christ take in with him?
Peter, James, and John.
Peter, James, and John, and the mother and Jairus, right? Where else do we see Peter, James, and John? We'll see them later in this next chapter for sure. The Mount of Transfiguration, right? Fishing. Who was in the Garden of Gethsemane with Christ and praying with him? Peter, James, and John.
They fell asleep. Actually.
Yeah, they're kind of Christ's inner circle. He's got 12 good friends, but 3 of them are kind of the really tight group. They're the ones that seem to be at the center of what's going on. In fact, later in this chapter, we'll find that James and John are arrogant enough to argue about who gets to sit on which side of Christ and his glory because they feel so close to Christ. So they're a tight-knit group, and he takes them in, and the girl is healed. She's raised. She's raised from the dead. He took her by the hand in verse 54 and called, saying, Maid, arise. And her spirit came back to her, and she arose straightway, and he commanded to give her meat. And her parents were astonished. And then again, as I mentioned earlier, but he charged them that they should tell no man what was done. I don't know how that secret doesn't get out. The whole town knows that this girl's dead, or that they believe she's dead anyway. She was sick. She died. We've got a group of mourners. There's been a crowd following Christ, and all of a sudden she's up. And if they don't know at that moment, in the next day or two, when she's out running around and helping her mom with chores, and she's going to be seen. She's a walking testimony to the power of Christ. But Christ says, you don't tell. I don't know whether it was, you don't tell exactly how I did this, because I don't know how you would keep it secret in a town like that. It's a busy community. Okay.
This one other part that it's hard for me to understand as well, because the previous.
There's just this one
miracles-
part?
Is that because the previous miracles, everybody saw what he did
Mm-hmm.
in front of crowds, but why, is it because she was a child? It's
I agree. It's hard for me to understand too. That some I can kind of understand on timing. You know, I don't want to mess with the Jewish leaders or something like that. But raise somebody from the dead in a town like that, that rumor's going to spread like wildfire. Julie,
Maybe it wasn't so much about keeping it a secret. There were a bunch of people there who knew. Maybe the point was, those are the people who were mocking me a minute ago. They're going to be the ones to spread this story.
could
You
be.
guys don't have to say anything. You can just sit back and say, yep, Jesus was here.
Yeah, you see that big plate of crow you just got to eat?
Right. Maybe it's more about who's giving the message, as in other
That could be.
stories of why he.
'Cause they
told
were
people not to
convinced.
tell. They didn't need to say anything. That crowd that was there and mocking him just moments before, they were the ones that were going to be telling us.
That could very well be. You don't have to tell it as a parents. You know, you want it to be so. Let's tell the people that don't want it so. Warren?
And the message comes across differently when, instead of hearing it from Jesus' followers, we already have
True.
an attitude against. But when those mourners and wailers tell you, some people who are your own peers, you're gonna
It does come across different from Christ's apostles telling the story, or followers. And the story before this with the casting out of legions, though, he's the one that the miracle was done on, and he tells him, you go tell everybody. So, you know, maybe it's that this girl is going to be her own living testimony, because she's going to be out there, I'm alive, you know. Maybe that's it, rather than the apostles or disciples or the parents. I mean, you'd think the parents would make a pretty good witness too, but he tells them not to say anything. It's just one of those things that during Christ's ministry, different things happen at different times, and I don't have the greatest answer to that question. There's some thoughts been thrown around here, but it could very well be true. So now we go to chapter 9. Somebody read verses 1 through 6 for me of chapter 9. Who will read that for me? Wyatt, thank you.
Then he called his 12 disciples together and gave them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. He sent them to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick. And he said to them, take nothing for the journey, neither staffs, nor bag, nor bread, nor money. And do not have 2 tunics apiece. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. Whoever will not receive you when you go out of that city, shake off the very dust from your feet as a testimony against them. So they departed and went through the towns, preaching the gospel and healing everyone.
Okay, so what's he tell these guys to do?
Go out unprepared.
Well, not just go out unprepared. Go out and spread the news everywhere. You parents, you shut up and don't tell anybody about your kid. It was just healed. But you 12, you go out and you tell everybody you can find the story of Christ. Now, when we tell the story of Christ, we're offering salvation, right? We're offering baptism into his death and burial and resurrection. We're offering heaven by following him, because that's what he's given us. Christ is still alive at this point. And he tells them to go out and tell the story. What story are they telling? Not about Christ's death, right? Hasn't happened yet. Or Timmy?
They must proclaim about physician is not to help you now. And preacher is not helping now. Is both this woman, is one, spend all money for physician, and they don't help her.
Mm-hmm.
And Christ help her. And ruler of synagogue can help, with the authority of synagogue mass healing. But they don't have authority for healing. They don't have possibility for healing. And they must proclaim for, you don't have another opportunity, you must have faith in Christ only.
Yes, and he gave them the ability to heal and to cast out demons and all that stuff. So their story is, we have the power of God. Christ is representing the power of God. He is the Messiah that's come. You heard from when you were a kid about the Messiah coming, the Jews had. This is him. And to prove it, we heal the sick. We raise the dead. We do all these miraculous things to show that we have the authority and the power over demons, over the underworld, afterworld, whatever you want to call it. We have that authority. Christ has that authority. God has given him that authority, and he's passed it on to us. So that's the message they're sending. Get ready. Christ is going to tell you something sooner or later that you need to do. And you need to be ready to do it. It's very much like John the Baptist's message. It's in preparation. This transition period between the Jewish law and the law of Christ is an interesting time period, because they're not under Christ's law until he is dead, buried, and raised. There's good moral teachings. There's, things that natural laws we should obey. And the Jews had their own set of rules that they needed to follow. But it doesn't take effect until Christ rises. So it's a big story about God's power, about the power of Christ, the authority of Christ. This is what they're preaching, and they go all over the place. And as Donna, go ahead.
Well, they knew the scriptures.
Mm-hmm.
The scriptures were read in the synagogue every week. The parents were charged with repeating them to their children.
When they sit down, when they walk, when they stand in the gate, yes.
Oh, yeah, a lot of people had these scriptures memorized just from hearing it so much. And I know a class I took in world history once, that was what they said about the Jews, is the Jews prized education. And so I think for a lot of us, we don't realize how much the people knew. And when you start making the parallels between, the scriptures say that this will happen, and here it is happening. And people have said that Mary couldn't have done that Magnificat, or the thing that she said after she realized that she was going to bear the Messiah, that she couldn't have said it, but she had all of that knowledge. She just put it all together. God help her put it all together.
God already put one miracle in her.
So that was one point, is that we don't realize how much they knew.
Yes, they were dependent on the priests and the synagogue rulers and all those for their education. And their education primarily was in scriptures. They learned how to farm. Yeah, they learned how to take care of animals. They learned, all those functional things in life, but their education, mental education, if you will, was primarily the scriptures. Whether it was memorizing them or going to synagogue every week or whatever it was. So Christ sends his apostles out, sends the 12 out, and I don't know, when I was a kid, for some reason, I don't know why, I always thought Christ did most of his work around Jerusalem. Not true. He went to Jerusalem towards the end of his life. This is where he did almost all his work. You don't see it here, but right about down in here, Nazareth is right in there. Bethsaida's over here. There's Capernaum. This whole Galilean area. And if you'll remember when in Acts 2, when the apostles were teaching and talking in tongues, that was one of the criticisms. Aren't these Galileans? These are stupid, uneducated Galileans. That's where they're from. So they go out all in this area, the 12 of them around that area. They're going to gather back up together here in a little bit. And as Donna mentioned, they're sent out without preparation. What? Why? Don't take 2 tunics. Don't take an extra pair of sandals. Don't take money in your bag. Don't do any of that stuff. Just go teach. Artemi?
I think it is a good parallel for this is woman was poor. He gave all her money for reason and be poor. And the woman is young woman is be poor too. He be on authority of father. He be poor, and he give this this opportunity for disciples for they be poor, like for have faith, for receive spirit, we must be poor. And I think this is maybe
Okay. That could be part of it, that he's teaching them a lesson to become like the people they're talking to. That could be part of it. Sure.
To be humble.
Oh, to be humble, yeah. Donna?
Give people an opportunity to give to them.
Yeah, that too. In every society, the religious leaders are supported by the people, right? That's just the way it is. You're expected to take care of the religious leaders. Now, obviously, our televangelists and some of those have taken that way beyond where it should be. But the concept of the people taking care of the preacher, the minister, whatever you want to call them, is something that is gone on for ages. That's not a new concept. James?
But it's interesting that it seems like they're not supposed to be moving around. So the point is not to get more money. In other words, don't stay in one place until you've drained them, move on to the next place, drain them. It's like, no, you stay there, and what you need to rely on them, whatever they're giving you. Mm-hmm. This is not a money-making opportunity for you. It's you're doing work for them. You are healing. You are preaching the good news. But in return, like Ethan said, humility. You're doing all these great works, but you need to be humble. And this is not I'm so amazing, let me start gathering all the money.
Aren't you glad that God didn't entrust you or me with that power? I'm not sure I could have been that humble. It's kind of like the mafia. Nice kid you got there. You want him to stay okay? I mean, it's amazing that Christ gave this power to basically uneducated men. I mean, Luke, we know, has a little more education than others. Matthew's got at least a professional job. But we don't. The others, mostly it's fishermen and uneducated people from that standpoint. And he gives them this power to oversee or to be over devils, to heal, cast out demons, all that kind of stuff that just is amazing, not only to them. In fact, we'll learn later on in the chapter that they don't even know how to handle it sometimes and can't even get it corralled and don't have enough faith to make it work. Daniel?
So interesting. The contrast to me for how he told all the demons, shut them up, right? And now the contrast here, I just find it interesting that he's just officially authorizing and giving them power and authority, I mean, even over the demons, right? And to do the healing. And I know it's so weird, so obvious, I guess. But when it finally starts clicking, I'm realizing how shallow my knowledge is. And I already knew that, and I'm like, it's worse than I thought. But it's good, time to learn. But that this build-up, it's so interesting because what Artemia was saying, and you and some others, this build-up and how the progression is moving towards who this Jesus is, and then a little bit later in verse 6, they're preaching the gospel. And what is the gospel? And they're talking about this Jesus, and I guess it never clicked in my mind, like this whole progression from when he starts to when he's going to die, and what all those people are thinking about him, and what's been taught about him by the authority given to those doing it properly and accurately, right? It's just interesting.
It is, and I think later on in the chapter, he says that the Son of Man has to be rejected and will be killed and will be raised. But don't go tell anybody. So he's timing his life. Most believe that this next story, or the next few stories here, are around Passover time in the spring of the year. When he feeds the 5,000, he tells them they can sit down on the grass and all that. So they think I believe it's in Matthew where it mentions the grass. They believe it's in springtime near Passover. So if that's correct, this is about 1 year before he enters Jerusalem and is to be killed. So he's been with them for 2 years. He's been teaching, he's been preaching, he's been healing, he's been giving them power, he's been giving them authority. But he's got this timeline, this march towards Jerusalem, where it's finally going to be culminated. And he's going to die and then be buried and be raised. And then all the gloves are off. Now you go and you tell the story everywhere, throughout the world. Not just up in Galilee, not just around Jerusalem, but as in Acts 2, to the uttermost parts of the world. He's prepping them for that work. And they have their failings. As I mentioned, we'll see another story here before long, where they couldn't cast out the demons. And Christ says, you don't have enough faith. Wait a minute, the apostles don't have enough faith? It gives me a little courage that even those men were not perfect, that they didn't quite get it all. And we know that after Christ died, I'm going to go fishing. That was nice while it lasted. They didn't get all the impact of who Christ was and what he was going to do. And it took them time, just like it takes us time. And just like when we teach somebody, they don't get it all at once. I don't get it all at once. I learn every week something new, it seems like. Either that or I'm getting old and I forgot what I learned before. That does happen too. But people, when they're coming to Christ, it takes time for them to understand what it is we're trying to get across. It's not just an immediate, oh, I got it. Yep, that's it. Even these apostles didn't have enough faith in some instances to do what Christ has asked them to do. And they had power to cast out demons. They had power to heal people. And yet their faith wavered at times and wasn't strong enough. That should give us some encouragement when we're weak. That should give us some encouragement when we fail. That as long as we get back up and get moving and get ourselves back on the right track, that's just part of human life. That's who we are. And it's a good thing God has a lot of mercy. Thanks for your comments. We'll continue in verse 7 on Wednesday night. Hello, Artemia.
You mentioned about they don't
I would absolutely. I mean, it's not why I bring you boxes. I bring you boxes because I have them and I'm like, oh, I know some things. But yeah, love
Their
the
faith wasn't strong enough.
How are you?
explain them better. The next thing is the students don't
Because they needed to develop their faith.
don't can give them directly, but they don't have capacity for it. Yes, some capacity, but
Not fully.
And yes, and not fully, and not fulfill this his commandment for them. They know about his fault, his fault disciples.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
They don't keep fasting and don't keep praying, don't enough, and they don't keep.
They don't let the power come into us. Yeah, I agree. Hey buddy, what's happening? Good. Hey buddy.